Alright, in this video we're going to talk about inverse functions. What is an inverse function? How do we write inverse functions given the original function? And basically that's what we're going to talk about. I'm going to give you an example here. Most people have just no idea of how to write an inverse function and how we actually find the inverse function given the original function. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So to understand what an inverse function is, I think we first need to address what a function is, and I have a simple definition here. A function is a special relationship where each input has a single output. And I think most of us watching this video probably know what a function is, but I have an example right here, a function of x, which is 2x plus 3. If we wanted to evaluate this function, say at x equals 1, we just go ahead and replace every spot where there's an x with a 1. Then we go ahead and use our order of operations to evaluate this function at 1. So our order of operations, we first wanted to look at the multiplication here. So we have 2 times 1. That gives us 2. And then lastly, we want to add 3. And this gives us 5. So we can see here we have a relationship where we have input has a single output here, and this is just a quick example at x equals 1, just to get familiarize ourselves with this a little bit more. So let's go ahead and jump into, I think something that needs to be addressed when talking about inverse functions is a quick review on what inverse operations are, because there's a nice connection between inverse functions and inverse operations. I think most of us have a really good understanding of inverse operations already. So if we want to have our original operation of addition, well, the inverse of addition is subtraction because it undoes the addition. So if we had 5, if we added 5, and we wanted to undo that, we would need to subtract 5. Likewise, multiplication, if we were multiplying something by 5, well, division undoes that original operation. So if we wanted to multiply something by 5 to undo that, we would need to divide that by 5. So as we can see, inverse operations essentially just undoes the original operation as we just saw. And I'll state that again. Inverse operations just undo the original operation. So let's go ahead and apply what we know about inverse operations to inverse functions. And I think we'll see a nice connection here. So as we looked at earlier, we had a function f of x equals 2x plus 3. First, let's look at what this function is doing so that we can undo this function. So I'm going to go ahead and just write function of x and this nice line here. And on this line, I'm just going to state what our function is doing. So first, our function, if we plugged in a value into x to evaluate it, the first thing we would do is multiply that value we plug into x by 2. So I'm just going to go ahead here and write multiply by 2. Okay. After we multiply by 2, the next thing our function, the next order of operation we would do here would be adding 3. So I'm going to go ahead here and say the next thing we do in our order of operations on this function would be adding 3. Alright. So the idea of an inverse function is to just undo, write a function that undoes what our original function does. And to do that, we want to go in the reverse order and just undo each of these steps. Okay, so to undo each of these steps, the first thing, or the last thing we did on our original function was adding 3. So if we want to undo 3, we want to just subtract 3. Alright, and the first thing our function did was multiply by 2. So if we want to undo multiplication by 2, well, we just divide by 2. That undoes our multiplication. Alright, and this is for our function, our inverse function. So another thing is, how do we write the notation for inverse function? Let's go ahead and write that right here. We have our inverse function of x. It looks like visually f to the negative 1 of x, but we state that as just the inverse function of x. Okay, so if I was to go ahead and write an equation now for the inverse function of x, I'm going to go ahead and do that. Over here we have f to the negative 1 of x equals, and we want to go this direction. So we undid the addition of 3 by subtracting 3. So we want to undo that. So we want to start with our variable, which is x in this case. And what are we doing to x to undo it? Well, we're subtracting 3. We lastly added 3, so we're subtracting 3 to undo that addition of 3. So there we go. We start with x and we subtract 3. Okay. Now we continue this direction. And we took x, we subtracted 3. That is some number. Okay. To undo this, we need to now divide this whole quantity by 2, because right here we want to undo the multiplication of 2, so we divided by 2. Okay, and there we go. We have our inverse function of x right here. So the connection here that I want you to see is that inverse operations and inverse functions are very similar. So most of you already know about inverse operations. And now to go to it, write an inverse function, it's just about showing what did our function originally do, and now how can I undo that going the other direction. Once you write out how you can undo it, it's just simple as starting with your variable and then going in the other opposite direction and just writing what are the operations that we are doing to x. And that is how we write an inverse function.